Welcome to this Southwark Cathedral podcast. Sir Anthony Seldon is an educator, historian, writer, commentator. He's the author, actually, of over 50 books on contemporary history, politics, and education, including the bestseller Johnson at 10 and Truss at 10, about two recent prime ministers. In 2021, Anthony Seldon, inspired by a fallen First World War soldier who dreamt of a via sacra to commemorate the war dead and stand as a marker for the triumph of peace, set out on a 1,000-kilometre walk tracing the historic route of the Western Front. And he wrote this up in a book called The Path of Peace. Now he's just published The Path of Light, in which he set out to walk 1,300 kilometres this time on a route from the same starting point to Auschwitz, discovering in the towns and the villages through which he walks stories of women and men who bravely protected the vulnerable and stood up to evil in the face of unimaginable brutality during that period of the Second World War. It's a fascinating book, which I enjoyed so much, and I was delighted to be joined by him to talk about the book further. So I am joined for this podcast by Sir Anthony Seldon, who is, a best-selling author for many works, but I'm particularly interested today to talk to him about his latest book called The Path of Light, Walking to Auschwitz, which I finished reading not too long ago and felt I really wanted to make contact with him to have this conversation. So I'm delighted and welcome, Anthony.
Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Really nice to be on.
So for those who don't know about this book, you first of all went out tracing the historic route of the Western Front, and you wrote a book about that called The Path of Peace. But this now is another book called The Path of Light. We've now entered into the Second World War period, not the First World War period. And it's a slightly longer walk, 1,300 kilometres. I wondered if you could just begin by telling our listeners a little bit about this journey, where you started and the route you took.
Well, yes, indeed. So after that first book, Mark, I thought never again. I thought this was completely bonkers. 35 days walking 1,000 kilometres, as you say. It was 1 million steps, and it was through soil where 10 million people had become casualties, creating a path of peace along which all could walk in common cause to find what they shared together rather than what divided them. And it was a dream of a First World War soldier, and he wrote it down. And then very shortly after he wrote down the idea of creating this path himself in the late 1910s or 1920s, he was killed in the war. Same day as Rudyard Kipling's son. So I wrote that and I thought, wow, I've done that, thank goodness. And then a couple of years later, the nagging thought occurred, well, why not start a book on the Second War, beginning from the precise moment where that walk started, which was on the Swiss border, which is where the First World War trenches finished, and walk all the way to Auschwitz and make it a book about the Second World War, looking not for more terrible people. I mean, have we not heard enough of the terrible people who did shocking things to other people? Where were those who risked their lives, often, frankly, lost their lives for the sake of protecting others? And they were often people of faith, often Christian, sometimes Jewish, sometimes with no express faith, and yet they clearly had a faith in human goodness and in love, and of love for something over and beyond their own material advantage in life. And so they were pointing towards the idea of loving one's neighbor and loving something beyond this world. I mean, I had no idea when I set out that I would find any such people, no idea at all. And I had no idea I'd be able to walk that far. And there were difficulties on the way, as the book describes. And I tried to walk where I could along rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Volga coming into Prague, and then the Elbe and the Oder, the Vistula, as you come into Poland and Krakow. Rivers are great in one way, they're flat, and not so good in another way, they bend, and that's very unfortunate. It takes longer if you're not going in a straight line. But anyway, there we are.
You also got a lot of mosquitoes.
I found them. Yeah, I think these mosquitoes have been brutalized by the Second World War, but they had altogether new levels of intent and came in all directions. I mean, they were just unlike anything I've ever seen on the Danube. And we were told it was because the Danube had flooded at the front of the banks about 2 weeks before and then receded. And for some reason, that was very advantageous for mosquito, if you're a mosquito, to thrive.
You're going on this long journey with difficulties, and you are seeking out what you call the figures of light. So human beings who, against all the odds in some ways in that period of history, were resolute enough inside to their moral conscience to look beyond their self-protection and seek to help others who were at risk and vulnerable. So this is a journey of hope in a way. You're looking for these figures of light, and yet you say at one point that it was a harder book to write than the other. And I just wondered why.
Well, superficial reasons, Mark, were because I was walking away from home. I was walking east rather than west. And there was something about walking back on that first book from the Swiss border to the English Channel, North Sea, that made me think every night I was getting closer home. I was getting further away, and then I can speak French, even if nobody understands what I'm saying. But, there's a sense there that I can just about comprehend it. But, Czech, even German, Polish, and other languages made it much more difficult. So it was a tough time geopolitically with the war in Ukraine. I felt I could almost hear the crash of shells and the scream of agony coming from further east, and the war in Gaza, Lebanon, Israel started. And I was asking a harder question, I think. I mean, the first one I was establishing, laying down a path. This was more of an esoteric mission to try to find goodness, as well as that sense that, to have a path across Europe, to a path of peace. Pilgrimages are there for a purpose. I mean, they've been part of human history. At one point, I found myself walking along the path that Martin Luther walked, and who was, as well as a completely remarkable, massive figure in history, also towards the end of his life became virulently anti-Semitic and was the most quoted theologian by the Nazis. And you have to say, where was the church in Germany? And the book is dedicated to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, known, I'm sure, to all listening, but also to someone called Etty Hillis, who was a Jewess, who exemplified and asked challenging questions about Christ, and even unto death, where she gave up her life, as did many others. But I was keen to find people who we did not, and I didn't want to talk at length about Oscar Schindler, but he came up because that's just by where that factory was in the Sudetenland, where he brought the Jews from Krakow to.
So some of the people that you mentioned, I knew about, of course, just because of what I do. And I have over my desk, as I sit here now, I have a picture of Bonhoeffer and Colby, and I have a poster of Bonhoeffer saying, "Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act." It's a very good reminder for any dean. But I just wondered whether you could maybe mention to us now a person who most people haven't heard of, and yet you were struck by something that they did at this period, a figure of light.
Well, there are so many that I came across. If I take Etty Hillesum, who was a lady who had a problematic teens and 20s, was in Amsterdam and went out to Westerbork camp, which was the same transit camp that after the Frank family were discovered in the attic on the 4th of August 1944, they were taken to Westerbork camp. And she was there and she could have escaped. So many people could have escaped, but they wanted to stay with the children and with the vulnerable, and she did. And she was a woman suffused with love of others, refused to hate those who were the prisoners and the guards, those who were brutalizing them, was full of a transcendent love of God in all that she did. And her last known act was to go away in the cattle truck. There were the roundups every week with the list of names. I mean, the cruelty is almost unimaginable. And she went away and she managed to throw a note that she wrote through a crack in the cattle door truck that just happened to have been discovered, authenticated. And she talked about how when the cattle truck left, she led everybody in singing and singing psalms, singing prayers, singing songs. And she died on about Christmas Day in 1943. But she was an example of something that you hint at that, Mark. I mean, there are these moments in our lives where there may only be one moment in our life where we are really called upon to act. I love that saying from Bonhoeffer about not to act is to act, not to speak is to speak. And what will we do? Who will we be when that moment comes for us? And how can we prepare ourselves for that moment when it comes? And even if we do die, if we do make that sacrifice in running towards the fire, is that not better than to live a life of subsequent misery and doubt, knowing that one missed the moment when one could really define one's whole life?
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, the book is trying to move away from bad people and yet more evil, because I think that reading about badness brings us down, and reading about good people encourages us and uplifts us. And the best tragedies are not sinister. They're different. Tragedy is not the same as a horror story. A horror story is written and consumed to make people fear, but by a tragedy, which is reminding us of our own imperfections and helping us to understand our own shadow more, but the possibility of redemption. This is uplifting. So I think that I tried. I'm not saying I succeeded, but tried to be uplifting.
Mm. Just after what you were saying, I was thinking of, I've just not long ago come back from Assisi, and one of the things that struck me, that one of the many things that struck me that St. Francis said, at one point he said, when we die, none of us can take anything with us that were given to us. We can only take with us what we gave.
Hey, I didn't know that. That's very wonderful, isn't it? And I was thinking something in church yesterday made me think about the pyramids and the pharaohs who were desperate on death to take this world on with them. And that was it. It was a passage from James, 2nd James 2, something in that came up. We can take away what we gave and our heart, but not anything that most of us, including me, have struggled so hard in my life for: reputation and credibility and position and income and none of it is anything, and yet we don't see that
until the hospital bed. Just a couple more things that struck me about this book. Occasionally, in fact, more than once, certainly, you sort of let on a little bit of frustration or irritability, even, that there weren't more figures of light. Why were people so quiet? Why were they so passive? Why weren't there more of these people? Is that something that you were troubled by?
Yes. Well, how do I know that if I was going to be putting, as a younger person, my children and wife lives at risk? Or could one do that? How could one do that with conscience? It's understandable. But also, I keep thinking I'm haunted by all those people. Goering was this Luftwaffe, very senior right-hand man to Hitler, and yet he had a brother who protected Jewish people. And now we know about him because he was Goering's brother. His life's a bit contested. How far did he really protect them? How far was he using that as a way of escaping punishment and being scapegoated after the war as a Nazi? And there's a lot of grey area. The proof that Yad Vashem, the museum memorial in Jerusalem, has to go through to prove that people really were helping is rigorous. So, but there was lots of grey area. But why is it that we know some people, but what about the 10 times, 100 times as many people who did extraordinary things who we never know about? The people who were just wiped away, their names, their lives wiped off the face of the world. And that's one of the things the Nazis tried to do, which was to erase all memory. It's paradoxical. They tried to erase all memory of the murders by blowing up crematorium, by getting rid of the records, and yet also in Prague they wanted to boast of the Museum of the Extinct Race, and were bringing in these weird, as they saw them, Jewish artifacts to people in the museum with. So, so much lost forever, and yet not lost forever, because the good they did endures, even if one can't put a human name to it.
I liked the last chapter, the sort of epilogue, where you make the comment that when all the sort of end of World War II anniversary celebrations happened fairly recently, there was lots of memory about wonderful people, things that had happened courageously and so on, but not a lot of comment about the lessons that we should be learning from World War II. I just wondered if you could spell out maybe a lesson that you have learned from this walk that you went on that you would like to share with us.
I think it's around the intrinsic value of life and time that we spend together. It will be familiar with many that who have had parents who passed on or who have children who are growing up or now grown up and left, that we, in the same way that we chase after the ephemeral, the things that give pleasure rather than joy and meaning, we get distracted by the times, the occasions when we're together that we really should be cherishing and nurturing. We allow ourselves to become irritated by, our siblings or our parents, or because people haven't cleared the table properly, or somebody wasn't appreciative enough over a present. And I think that the war and the loss of 50 million people who cannot have that chance again reminds us of the importance of savoring what really matters in life, and to do so reflectively. And so many people let their lives just be dominated by the ephemeral, by the impatient, by the urgent, by the transactional, but feeling slow so that we feel deeply and we learn to cherish the things in life that matter. And we have a school system that validates young people not for who they are, but for what they achieve in exams. I mean, that's so brutal, so wrong.
Mm. And finally, you're a person of Christian faith, and you talk
Correct.
about that in the book. Did this affect it, what you were learning en route?
It was a pilgrimage, and it made me realize how much further I have to go to live as Christ says we should live, with the Beatitudes, where we are humble, where we are open, where we are full of love, where we're listening to the will, and we ask in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." And it made me realize that I think in my head that I'm a Christian, but what am I? How am I living that? How much further have I got to go? And so moving on, just the sense of walking in life, the hospital bed that you referred to as an emblem for the fact that we all finish life, and many in a hospital bed, and we should be more prepared for that. I mean, we should be thinking this should be a reality for us more. It would help us to get a perspective on our life. I mean, so much of what we do and say has no perspective or little perspective on what really matters. And so, yeah, I mean, it's made me realize I've still got so much further to go. I mean, maybe a walk to the Ukraine front line if I can manage it.
Well, you mentioned the Lord's Prayer, and certainly this is a book focused on those people who were trying to make it on earth as it is in heaven, while so many around them were trying to make it on earth as it is in hell. And for that, I think it's a beautifully redressing book, because, as you say, so often we focus on the darkness and the shadow of this period, but there are these figures of light, and you've brought them into the light, and I think that's a wonderful thing. This podcast will go beautifully with two others that we've done. Lawrence Rees on the Nazi mind talked to me about his book. And also recently we had Jack L. High, who wrote the book about Douglas Kelly and his interviewing of Goering before the Nuremberg trials. And
extraordinary.
Yeah,
My
he was
goodness.
fascinating.
Oh, my goodness.
So this is a nice little trio of related podcasts, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on. It's such a privilege. Writing books is very lonely. It's a privilege and a joy to be able to talk and reflect about them afterwards. And thank you.